안녕하세요 여러분! Everything Korean back again. Here is a new video that I made because a lot of people are requesting for me to continue this. So, I remade old video and this is going to be a more in-depth lesson that is going to be tackling all the other things that I forgot to mention in the previous one. So let's go! So by the end of this video, you are going to learn how Koreans structure their sentences, the topic or the subject particle 는, 은, and 이, 가, respectively, the difference between them, the object particle 를 and 을, the location particle 에, and lastly, 이다, which is to be. Remember that you can go and skip to the parts that you wanted to start with. Just check on the timestamps that I have on the description box below. So without further ado, let's start with the very first one. But before we go ahead and learn how Koreans structure their sentences, let's have a review first of the basic English grammar. So basically, in English, a simple sentence consists of a subject and then a verb. Now, what is a subject? As we all know, a subject is the part of the sentence who performs the action, while the verb is the word that expresses the action. So for example, if I ask you, what did you do today? And then you said, I ate. I there is going to be our subject and ate is going to be our verb. Now, let's have the example, I ate an apple. Notice that I added an apple, which is our object here, or the one who receives the action or whatever the verb is acting on. So now, our sentence doesn't just have a subject and a verb, but also an object. A while ago, I asked you, what did you do today? And you said, I ate. But if I ask you specifically, what did you eat? You can say, an apple, or I ate an apple. And an apple here is now our object, which the verb eat or ate has acted on. And that made our sentence more complete. But what about in the sentence, I slept? Can we add an object in the sentence? The answer is actually no. Why? Because slept or sleep is what we call an intransitive verb. And intransitive verbs does not have an object that receives the action. Like for example, we cannot say, I slept an apple or I slept the bed, right? That sounds ridiculous. I also cannot ask you specifically, what did you sleep? That's going to sound incorrect. However, I can ask you, where did you sleep? And you can say, I slept on the bed. But now, on the bed here is not an object, okay? It's a location. So again, let's have a review. In a sentence, we can have a subject and a verb. And it can be understood already. Much like a while ago when I asked you, what did you do today? And you said, I ate. That's going to be understood that you ate maybe lunch or dinner based on the context. But you can also add an object, which makes it much more complete. As in this case, I ate an apple. But sometimes in a sentence, we really cannot add an object. Just like intransitive verbs, I slept. And instead, we add location or other things. Aside from verbs, we can also use adjectives on basic sentences. First, what is an adjective? So an adjective describes a noun, but unlike a verb, it cannot act on an object, much like intransitive verbs that we had a while ago, right? So instead, we use be verbs to indicate the state of being. So our be verbs are am, is, are, we, and were. So for example, we have the sentence, I am smart. I there is our subject, smart is the adjective, and of course, the verb is am, which indicates our state of being, meaning right now, and I am talking about myself. Finally, based from the examples that we had a while ago, there are 3 ways how English speakers structure basic sentences. So we have the subject verb, as is the case for I ate or I slept. We also have subject, verb, and object. And our example for that is I ate an apple being our object. And lastly, we have subject, be verb, and adjective. And the example is I am smart. So you may be wondering why we have to talk about this when we should be learning the Korean language, but bear with me because your understanding of the Korean grammar will all go back to this. Now that you understand and remember the grammatical concepts of the English sentences, we can compare it now to the Korean language. So for a basic sentence in English, with a subject and a verb, the subject comes first, followed by the verb. So for example, the sentence is I ate and I slept. The subject here is I, and the verb are ate and slept. Now for the Korean language, it's just the same. So no need to worry about that. The subject comes first, followed by the verb. So we also say I ate, I slept. So just remember in this sentence that verb ate here can still act on an object. So I can still ask you specifically, what did you eat? And you can say, I ate an apple, or I ate rice. But the word slept here cannot act on an object because, again, it's an intransitive verb. And intransitive verbs cannot act on an object. If you forgot about that, you can go back and review it on the very first lesson. Now, here is where it gets tricky. So if I ask you again, specifically what did you eat for today? You need to add an object, right? So, if in the English language, we construct our sentences with the subject first, followed by the verb, and then the object last, in the Korean language, it's the other way around. So after the subject, it's going to be followed by the object, and the verb is going to be last. So let's have the example, I eat rice. Here, our subject comes first in English, followed by eat, which is our verb, and object, which is the rice. But in Korean, since it's interchanged, we say, I rice eat. Our subject is I, our object is rice, and our verb is eat. So this is how Korean structure their sentences. The verb always comes last. Now, onto a sentence with an adjective. In English, when we construct a sentence with an adjective, we use be verbs to indicate the state of being. Therefore, we have the subject first, followed by the be verb, and the adjective last. But here is another confusing thing. In Korean, we just say the subject followed by the adjective. Therefore, we do not use be verbs with adjectives. So for example, we have the sentence, I am beautiful. I is the subject, am is the be verb, and beautiful is the adjective. And since we do not use be verbs with adjectives, we just say, I beautiful. I being the subject, and beautiful being the adjective. And lastly, I want you to remember this. It is understood that both in English and Korean, that unlike verbs, adjectives cannot act on an object. I cannot stress this enough. Adjectives cannot act on an object because only verbs can act on an object. But that doesn't mean that you cannot put an object in a sentence with an adjective. It just means it cannot act on the object much like verbs can. Let's now go to the next one, which is the topic or the subject particle. But before we start there, let us first define what a particle is. Particles indicates the role of a word in a sentence. That is specifically which word is the subject, the object, or even the location. So note that in English we don't have these particles and we don't use anything like these, so there's no way to translate them. That is why for today, we're going to start with the very first one, which is the topic or the subject particle. From here on out, you need to have an understanding of the Korean alphabet. So if you don't, I suggest that you review them first. Let's have the topic particles, which are attached to the noun of the sentence, and we use nun and un. So when do we use nun? When do we use un? We use nun when the last letter of the last syllable is a vowel. So for example, we have the word man, which in the Korean language ends in a vowel, namja. Therefore, we have to add nun. So we say namjanon. On the other hand, when it ends in a consonant, we have to use un. For example, the word bread, which is pang. Therefore, we have to add un since it ends in a consonant. So we say pang은. So again, we have nam자는 and pang은. So the only reason why we use different particles depending if it ends in a vowel or a consonant is just for pronunciation ease. It's easier to pronounce words that ends in a vowel when we use the topic particle nun, and it's easier to pronounce words that ends in a consonant when we use the topic particle un. Now, same with the topic particles, we also have the subject particles, which are also attached to the noun of our sentence. But here, we don't use nun and un. We use the particles I and ka. So when do we use I? When do we use ka? Ka is used when the last letter of the last syllable is a vowel. So for example, for the word women, which ends in a vowel in the Korean language, yoda. Therefore, we are going to add ka. So we say yodaga, right? Next, we use I when the last letter of the last syllable is a consonant. So for example, we have the word ball, which in the Korean language is kung. Therefore, we add I since it ends in a consonant, kungi. So again, we have yodaga, kungi. And it's the same for the topic particles. The only reason why we have different particles if it ends in a vowel or a consonant is for pronunciation ease. You may have been wondering right now what's the difference between the topic and then the subject particles. So in the next part of this lesson, we are going to be differentiating between them. But remember that the general purpose of this part of the lesson is just to give you a general understanding that there is actually a difference between them. But if you don't understand, you don't have to worry because it's really difficult to explain it right now, and you will just understand as you progress along with your Korean grammar. There are actually a few differences between the subject and the topic particles. And right now, you need to remember that with the limited amount of vocabulary and grammar understanding that you have, it's actually difficult to fully explain the distinction or the difference between them. So if you don't understand, don't worry. You're going to understand it more as you progress along with your Korean grammar. So right now, the only thing that I can say most of the time is that topic particles are used when it is the main subject of our sentence, while we use the subject particles if it's not the main subject of the sentence, or if there is going to be follow-up sentences after that first part of the clause or the sentence. Another distinction is that we use the topic particles to indicate a general statement, while on the other hand, subject particles is used to describe a specific situation that the speaker just realized or observed right at that moment. Another one, Topic particles has a role of indicating that something is being compared with something else. We don't actually use subject particles for that, the e and ka, because it will sound awkward for native speakers even though you might not notice it. So don't try to use it when you compare two things. Another thing, the subject markers that we use is the subject particles when we want to emphasize the subject doing the action, which in contrast to the topic particles, we only use it if we want to emphasize a general fact about the subject. So if you want to emphasize an action done by a subject, use the subject particles. If it's more on the descriptive part or if it's on descriptive sentences, use the topic particles. And then lastly, we use e and ka with the preceding noun whenever we use anida, itta, or opta and words that you will learn in the future. So we call this fixed expressions. Don't worry if you don't understand it right now. You're going to understand it as you progress along in the few lessons that you're going to take. So just take note of it. Now let's go back and try to use the topic particles on our sentences for the structure, subject, and verb. So for example, we have the sentences I eat and I sleep. Of course, our subject is I and our verbs are eat and sleep. So we learned that the topic particles are attached to the noun or the subject of our sentence. So what we have to do is we have to attach 는 to I to say that I is our subject. So I, 는, sleep, which in the Korean language is 나는 자다. I sleep. What about for I eat? So since our subject here is I and our verb is eat, we have to add 는 to our I, to our subject. So we say I는 eat, which in the Korean language is just 나는 먹다.